Okay. Hi, everybody. My name is Jason. I'm Technical Service Manager here with WH Leary Company. Today, I'm going to give you some training and a tutorial on our Monet user interface, basically our gluing and detection software. Okay. Well, that was really the first three stations or setup menus within the Monet program. Everything after this point is basically a repeat. It's all the same. It's a gluing and detection station. So they're going to look pretty much the same. We can really spend our time on one of these and kind of go through all the features, and it'd be no different than going into each individual one. And you guys are probably pretty familiar with that at this point. But we're going to go into gluing and detection station 1. And the first thing I want to talk about on our gluing and detection station, I'll go ahead and turn the simulator on so we can see our live detected patterns. Okay, so you can see our black lines are our programmed events and the white lines are our detected events. Okay, and it looks like we're gluing and detecting perfectly right now. So the first thing I wanted to show you is the start end tolerance. So this little 10 millimeters value in the upper left corner of the panel. If I touch that, I can manipulate or change what's called my start end tolerance. And it's a little bit easier to see now that I shortened it. So I tighten my start end tolerance from 10 millimeters to 5 millimeters. So you can now see these little kind of dotted lines that are kind of straddled around the start of my first event. You guys can see that okay? When it was at 10 millimeters, you couldn't quite see it as well. When I opened it up really wide, you could see one part of the start tolerance, but you can't see the other one because it's actually off the front of the carton. So my recommendation is to always try keeping your tolerance settings set to where you can visually see, the start and or the both ends of the start tolerance and both ends of the end tolerance. So you guys can see the little dotted lines around the first event, the start of the first event. Those same dotted lines are kind of straddled or centered around the end of the last programmed event. So you guys can see that okay. So basically this is my criteria for glue detection, what we deem as acceptable. So this is my start tolerance. It needs to see my glue start within this little window here. And most end users, they depict the gap or space between these little dotted lines as 5 millimeters. It's actually 10 millimeters. It's actually a plus minus tolerance. So we know the glue is programmed to start at 8 millimeters here. That's where this black line starts from the lead edge of the panel. And because this is a plus minus tolerance, we're basically saying the start of that detected glue line can start up to 5 millimeters early from where I programmed it or 5 millimeters late from where I programmed it. So in other words, the overall window of opportunity here is actually 10 millimeters. It's a plus minus 5 millimeters from the program start. Does that make sense? All right. And that same tolerance is applied to the visually you can see it on the back or the end of the final programmed event. So I can see the end of the final event is programmed to end at 219.5 millimeters, which is the end of this black line. And I can see my end tolerance is centered around the last event. Now, whatever you program your start end tolerance is, it's going to be the same for the start and for the end. So you have one value for both of those tolerance markers. And the other thing to be mindful of is even though we can only visually see that tolerance marker on the start of the first event and the end of the last event, it is in fact applied to the start and end of each event that is programmed in between these. It's just visually we're only showing the start of the first event and the end of the last event. There is a limit that we can set behind the scenes on how big you can create the tolerance. The start end tolerance value is usually a password protected field. We can assign your manager level password to it if you'd like. Again, if you go too large on the tolerance, you could see on this panel here, if this panel is in fact 228 millimeters and I'm ending my last event at 219.5, If I program a 10 millimeter tolerance, I can potentially glue off the end of that carton and I would still accept it. I would still say that's a good carton because I opened up my tolerance to where my end tolerance is actually hanging off the back edge of the panel. So just some things to kind of be mindful of when you're programming start end tolerances. Some criteria isn't as critical as others. Some can be a little bit more laxed than others. But is there any questions on programming your start end tolerance value for your glue gun? So we're on glue station number 1 right now. Okay, it's pretty straightforward. Good. All righty. Next thing I'd like to talk about is actually programming glue events or making adjustments to glue events. And I'm going to go ahead and stop the simulator while we go through this part. All right, so now you can only see my programmed events because I'm not detecting anymore. We're not running anymore. So Glue Gun 1 currently has 3 events programmed. You can see event 1 here is highlighted green. The 8 millimeters is the starting position of that glue event from the lead edge of the carton. So the lead edge is 0 always. We always reference everything from the lead edge of the panel. So my first glue event is programmed to start at 8 millimeters from the lead edge of the panel and end at 39 millimeters from the lead edge of the panel. Okay. You can notice with event number 1 highlighted, there's a little green triangle centered on the first event. So it's just showing you what we're looking at. So if I go over here to event number 2 and I touch it, you can see the little green triangle move to the center of event number 2. I could do the same thing for event number 3. All right. So now we're going to adjust a glue event. So if I go back to number 1, it's highlighted green. Now if I touch the event box for event number 1 again, another window is going to pop open. This is where I program the start from the lead edge of that glue event and the end from the lead edge for that gluing event. So if I wanted that glue event to start a little earlier, let's say at 5 millimeters, I simply just open this up. I program my new parameter, hit the check mark here, and there's one more check mark to hit to save it. Now this is important, and a lot of people forget this. Once I make my adjustment, I could see it visually started a little earlier. It's at 5 millimeters now, the start of the first event. But if I were to hit the X right now to close this menu, do you see what happened? It reverted right back to 8 millimeters. So you want to make sure you hit the check mark twice. So when I open up the event, I can change my start parameter, hit my check mark. Now I want to hit my check mark here to close this menu also. And now it's going to save my 5 millimeters. Okay, so I basically started that first glue event just a little bit earlier than where it originally was. So when I open up my event box again, I could put my start of my event back where it was by programming 8, or you can use this these plus minus buttons on the keypad to incrementally adjust it per millimeter. So I can just tap it up to 8, hit the check mark. There I go. I'm back to where I was. Now I can hit the check mark again to save it. All right. Same applies to the back end of the event. I could open up the event box. Obviously, the first value here, this first window, represents the event start from the lead edge. That's what this graphic is trying to show you. And then the last event, or the last box here, is where my event ends in reference to the lead edge of the panel. Okay, so if I wanted to make it a little longer, let's see, it was at 39. If I changed it to 45, now you can see my glue event's a little bit longer. And I changed it here as well. Any questions on adjusting the start or end positions of glue events? That's pretty straightforward. Okay. Some other things we can do. We can also change what the event type is. Right now, our events are programmed as solid lines. There are other types of events. Spotting events is what we call them. The one other than a solid line is a row of spots. So we call this a variable pitch spot pattern. And whenever you program, you can see my event number 1 box that's highlighted green. It no longer shows a solid line because when I opened it up, I actually changed the type of event it was from a solid line to a spot pattern. So now my event actually shows up as a spot pattern as well. If you program a spot event, you have the menu in the upper right corner to adjust the spot spacing, what we call pitch. So right now my spots are spaced out pretty far, 18.5 millimeters apart from each other. I can decrease that value to 5. Now I made the spots a lot closer. So now if I look at that event number 1, I could see that I've got a lot more dots because I decreased the space in between them. My event's still the same. My length of my event still starts at 8 and ends at 39.5, but I put more dots in here now because I decreased my gap value or my pitch value. All right. The other setting we have for spot patterns is the size, and that's actually measured in time. So that's milliseconds. So the larger or the longer the duration, the what we call spike duration, the larger the dot. So there's no exact correlation with how many millimeters, diameter will your dot be with a 5 millisecond spot size. A lot of that is dependent on the type of glue you're using, the viscosity, and other characteristics of the glue. So when you're trying to achieve a very specific dot size, it could be a bit of trial and error depending on your glue. So the glue is ultimately kind of affects, and pressure to an extent. Pressure and the makeup of the glue will affect the size of the dot depending on what your spot size duration is set to. We kind of talked about the events, the different types of events. You guys may really not find much benefit of anything other than these first two, the row of spots or the solid line. Behind the scenes, I can actually program the system to only allow you a set or a very limited amount of event types. You can actually access that with your password, with your manager level access to the system menu. You have this gluing tab here with your access to the system setup menu and this spotting options. So this allows us to decide whether or not we even want anything else available other than a solid line. And I guess that's a good question. Do you guys use the spotting options at all on your glue application, or is it only solid lines?
Just solid lines, I believe.
So what we could do is we could turn the spotting options off, and it just a little bit more simplifies what you have access to or what the end user can see now. Now I don't have that drop-down menu in the middle of the event box anymore. Now my only option is to program solid line events. Okay. You do still have the ability to set because you still have this spotting options menu here, which we touched on. The top one is the gap or space between dots, and this one just below it is actually the size of the dots in time, duration, milliseconds. We have a speed reference setting at the bottom of the spotting menu, and that's called our auto spotting speed. And I don't know if you guys would find a ton of benefit within it or not, but if I program a speed within this little value or this parameter here, our auto spot speed parameter, now even though I have solid lines programmed for my 3 events, if I were to actually slow the machine down to that speed reference I just programmed, or to slow enough to that speed or below it, let's see if okay, so I just dipped below 25 meters per minute. And you guys see what happened to glue gun number 1? It went into what we call a spot mode. And the reason we do this is because we know that when we're running at very slow speeds, the volume of adhesive can be much greater. And sometimes pressure control doesn't really minimize the amount or volume of adhesive we're putting on the product at very slow speeds. So what we have available is called, the automatic spotting speed, to where if you're what we call jogging or inching product through the machine, maybe the solid lines is too excessive and you're just making bad product. And this could possibly or potentially allow that product to still be good while running it at those very slower speeds. If you're not interested or don't find use for using the auto spot speed, it's recommended to just leave at 0. And then no matter what speed, you'll be extruding solid lines. But it'll work automatically. If you program the speed, the system will just know, even though we've got solid line events programmed down here, we program solid events. Once I get, above the set speed, which in this case is 25 meters per minute, once I get above it, it'll know to just go right back to solid lines again. I think you're referencing these here. Now, when you increase the speed to a certain point, if the event is short enough, like this one is starts at 9, ends at 20, that's an 11 millimeter long event. If I run fast enough, the system is smart enough to know when to take that solid line event and turn it into a spot event, just because of the linear speed or travel of the substrate. And that's when you would normally, or you guys may have seen it before, where you might see a very short line event turn blue from black. So the programmed events are normally black. But if you ever see it turn blue, it's actually, the system's actually telling you, well, you're running so fast that I'm just going to spike the valve and use use what we call like a spot option or spot output as opposed to a line event output. And the system will do it on its own. It's intuitive enough to know the math on when it's running too fast to be able to spike, hold, and then stop. Even though we're not using the spike on your specific valves, it'll just know when it needs to actually change that very short line event into a spot event. So if I change that to, just well, let's say a 3 millimeter long line. If we run a little bit faster, I'll break my program. You guys might have noticed that really short line event. If you look closely at it, hopefully it shows up the same on yours. It probably turned blue. Mine turned blue. I don't know if you could see that first event here. Because that event is so short, even though I programmed it as a line event, the software is smart enough to know that it's just gonna kind of use a spot mode on that first event. So that's why sometimes you'll see very short line events turn blue when you increase the speed. But once you make that line larger, I apologize. Do we remember where it originally was? I think it was at 20. Yeah, it was 9 to 20. Okay. So if I put that back, end that first event back where it originally was, make it a little longer, back to 20 millimeters, then you can see it went back to black again. So it really only applies to like short events after you hit a certain speed. Sure.
I think some of the customers are worried about like recyclability with glue overseas and stuff, so maybe they would look at a spotting option to help minimize some of the glue weight on the cartons.
We do hear that. We do hear that a lot. A lot of people find they can get their adequate bond and make good product with less material, less adhesive. So we do hear that from certain customers that they prefer to minimize the amount of adhesive as much as possible. It saves them money and they're still creating good product. So we do hear that from time to time, and it is an option. So probably what I would recommend us setting your systems up as just having the variable pitch only. So that way when an operator or an end user goes to set the system up, they basically only have two options, a solid line or a row of spots. If they pick the row of spots, they can program their gap and their size.
So is that gap in the size specifically for this pack? Can I change a different gap and glue pulse, time frame on a separate, like on a pack A versus a pack P, or is that kind of like a global setting?
So it's a setting per glue valve. So for this glue station number 1, putting down these 3 glue lines, I can have one programmed spot gap and size for all glue events from this glue gun. So each glue gun has its individual spot setting. So glue gun 2 can have different size dots and spacing from glue gun 1, from glue gun 3, so on and so forth. So it's specific to the glue valve itself.
Okay, so like glue valve 1 can have a certain set, and then on a different pack, glue valve 1 can still have a different set of numbers, right?
Yeah, so as a different pack,
Okay.
a different job?
Yep.
Okay, yes. You can change it. Yes, you can change it as you'd like for the different jobs. I don't believe it'll save with the job. Spot events, spotting options, gap and size. It's global. Yeah, so it's a global setting actually. Once you set your gap and your size, it's going to save with that gun. It's going to save with that glue valve. But when you run a different job, you can of course change it. But whatever you set it as last is what it'll save as.
Okay.
Okay. All right. Any questions on adjusting an event start, adjusting an event end, or changing it from spots to solid lines? Surprised nobody's asked me how to delete an event or add an event yet. Well, we'll do that right now. So let's say we identify that we just do not need this third glue event for glue gun number 1, and we want to delete it. That's fine. What I can do is I can come over to event number 3. I can touch it to highlight it green. I can touch it again to bring open the event box menu. And this little circle with the line going through it will allow you to delete this glue event. So if I touch that, it's going to ask you if there's product running through the machine, it's always going to prompt you, are you sure you want to make, this change while running product? Do you want to change job settings while running product? So you can simply hit the check mark for yes, and now I'm down to 2 events. I can do the same thing for event number 2. I can open it up and I can delete it. It's going to ask me, are you sure we're running product? Hit the check mark for yes. Now I'm down to 1 event. You cannot delete. You have to have at least 1 glue event. It won't let you delete 1 glue event. So if you've got the glue valve turned on, it's expecting you to at least be gluing 1 event. You can put down up to 20 glue events per trigger pulse, per panel. So per product or per trigger length, you can put up to 20 events. Any combination you want. They can be spots and lines. If you want to add a glue event, it's pretty simple. You always have this little plus icon on the right-hand side of the panel. If you touch the plus, of course, it's going to continue asking me if I want to make these changes while running because I'm simulating that I'm running right now. Whenever you start a new event, it always starts at 0. So you can kind of see when the event box opened up, it shows my values at, turn my alarm off here. It is, okay. So when I go to create a new event, it always starts me at 0. If you look closely, you can actually see a little dot right at the lead edge of the carton. That's because I haven't programmed it yet. Ideally, you would program additional events with the machine not running. Simulator off. All right, so I just turned my simulator off. So now I'm not running. So I can see where my first event is at. I don't like that. Let's put that back at 0. Okay, so I can see my first event here starts at 8, ends at 39.5. My new event is 0 and 0. So when I open it up, I just program where I'd like that next event to start. I wanted it to start at 55. So now I can see the start of my next event, and I can program where I want it to end. I could make it 85. That's a 30 millimeter pattern. So now you can see my 2 events. I just programmed this one. I'm looking at event 1. I can touch event box 2. The triangle moves over. I can continue adding events up to 20. So I can add another event. Again, every time you go to add a new event, it always starts at 0. So you got a program where you want that new event to start and end. So I can see my last event I just programmed end at 85. So my next one maybe starts at Now 115 and goes to 145. All right, now I have 3 events programmed here. Again, your start end tolerance, no matter where your first event or your last event is programmed, your start end tolerance is always going to center itself at the start of the first programmed event and the end of the last programmed event. All right, so this glue pattern does not look right to me. Down at the bottom here, I have a copy glue pattern option, which every glue station will have at the bottom. And I know this glue gun 1 should be extruding the same glue pattern as 2, 3, and 4. So if I hit this copy glue pattern button, I can select any one of the 2, 3, or 4 glue guns because I know they should all be the same. Right now it's on pattern 2, and I hit the check mark, and it just now made them identical. So once you program your glue events for one valve and you know they're correct, and your subsequent valves or your additional valves are supposedly extruding the same pattern, you can just copy the first pattern to the additional glue valves or stations. You just open the copy pattern button and select which one you want to copy it from. All right. Also on the bottom, we have the manual purge icon. So this is how you can purge the glue valve from the touchscreen. You have a couple options here. I can purge all of the glue valves I currently have turned on, which would be 1 through 8, because that's what I have turned on. Or I can just purge the glue gun that I'm currently in right now, which is glue gun 1. Just below that, we have 2 types of purge signals. We have what's called a stream purge, which basically just holds the nozzle open or holds the valve open and allows the pressurized material to flow through the nozzle. And we also have what's called a hammer purge, which basically rapidly cycles the output or spikes the output, kind of allows the valve to open and close rapidly while we're purging glue. I get a ton of questions on which one's better. I don't know that one is necessarily better than the other. I personally feel like the stream purge allows more flow through the nozzle. So if you're purging for, if your means of purging is to possibly clear or clean out a blocked orifice on a nozzle, I personally prefer the stream purge, but you'll find plenty of end users that might have a different opinion on that. There's no right or wrong way. To activate the purge, you just simply hit this little purge icon here, and to stop it, you just touch it again, or you can hit this little arrow to make the menu disappear. So either one of those. Yep, sorry.
Does that hammer purge occur at that higher voltage?
Usually, yes, and because we have the speed star at 0, but you can still hammer purge now. Yeah. Yeah, so it does not with the speed star valve. It does not with the valve that your hot melt applicators. It does not, and that's right. Your speed star, your hot melt applicator actually has a microprocessor built on top of it, and we basically supply it a signal, and it can actually do its own thing. So it's using its kind of own circuitry for that hammering purge application.
Okay. Okay.
All righty. The next one's pretty. Any other questions on the purge menu? It's pretty simple and straightforward. All right, this one's pretty important. This is our gluing and detection setup menu. So station 1 setup, every glue gun has, again, just a reminder, everything we're going in right now, every one of these gluing and detection stations has the same icons in the same location. So they're all identical. On the gluing and detection setup menu, we have some pretty important features here. Parameters that need to be filled out correctly for the system to perform correctly. So the first thing is our lead distance measurement. So we have a trigger 1, set up on the machine, mounted on the machine, and it's assigned to 4 glue valves. So that one trigger, we need to make sure we get a very accurate measurement between the trigger light spot and the glue valve tip. So that's what this first parameter here, and of course we rely on that being accurate, so when we program where we want the glue to apply it on the product, it actually applies it in the right place. So it's a pretty critical setting here. Of course, it's a setting we cannot learn. It's part of the initial setup and commissioning of the system. So this is what we call our valve lead distance. So from the trigger light spot to the valve tip. So it's part of the commissioning and setup of the system. We need to make sure that's as accurate as can be, so our gluing is accurate. The more accurate this stuff is, the more accurate our gluing and detection will be. So again, the first one is just our physical measurement from the trigger light spot to the glue nozzle tip. The second measurement just below it here would be the same trigger light spot to the detection light spot, or the detection area of the hot melt sensor, detection sensor. So ideally, I would just plan to measure, to the center of where that photo cell for the detection is mounted. Okay, so those are our two gluing and detection lead distances. First one, again, is a trigger to valve lead distance. And the second one is our trigger to detection lead distance. And again, we rely on both of those measurements to be as accurate as possible so the gluing and detection functions properly. Any questions on the two lead distance measurements here?
Jason, on those lead distance dimensions, is that a screen that can be locked in the manager's password?
It can, yeah. That's a good point, Keith. We could actually, once we have this dialed in, we can put your manager password, assign it to these values, so they're just not easily or accidentally changed when they shouldn't be. And that might be one more thing I'll show you in the system menu. With the installer level access to the install menu, the in-system setup menu, we can actually activate a feature that allows you to assign passwords to different icons or parameters throughout the entire program. And I'll make sure to show that to you. Trigger assignment. Now, again, we should never really need to worry about changing the trigger assignment. We only have two triggers on the machine, and we know trigger 1 is assigned to valves 1, 2, 3, and 4, and trigger 2 is assigned to valves 5, 6, 7, and 8. But this is where we actually go to change the trigger assignment. This little up and down arrow right next to the trigger symbol. So again, and Keith, that's another thing. So pretty much everything in this menu, once it's properly set, probably should be password protected with at least the manager level password. There's really no need to change any of these things once they're dialed in and set correctly. Earlier, we were talking about when we were looking at the LED screen, I think Alicia pointed out there's two different valve signals. There was a spike signal and a hold signal. And typically with cold glue extrusion valves, we use both of those signals. We spike the valve for a very short duration to open the plunger, to pull the plunger into the coil as quickly as possible. And then we don't require that higher voltage to hold the valve open. We can then drop it down. On your hot melt applicators, yours will be set to 0 because we are actually using a straight 24 volt only output to your valves to activate them. So yours will be 0 milliseconds always. You will not have a high time or spike duration programmed in this menu. I have it set to 2 milliseconds just because it's facilitating, my simulator, being able to kind of perform this training live. But your high time duration will always be set to 0 milliseconds. Okay. We have an option down here. Does require a password normally. Yep, looks like it requires your password at least. 128. This feature here in the setup menu allows the system to perform a machine stop for one failure. So if there is one failure from this gluing station, glue gun 1, gluing and detection station, if there's one failure detected, it will stop the machine. It's not a real popular option, but it is an option that some people request for, and it is available if it's needed. It's an option to stop the machine for one failure. So that's kind of what this icon, one failure equals a stop. We also have a test feature. It's called a no glue test feature. That's what this button is here. It won't let you do it if the detection alarm is off. So my main system alarm for alarming and rejecting is in the top right corner. That would have to be turned on first in order to utilize this test feature. So what this no glue test feature is for is to ensure that we're kicking out the right carton when we fail for bad glue or a bad product. So the way it works is, as long as you have the detection alarm turned on, while you are running product through the machine, you can open up this setup menu for any of the glue stations. You can go down to the bottom where this green check mark is, and you can touch the green check mark. What will happen after you touch the green check mark is the next product that arrives to this station, that arrives to trigger 1, it will disable the valve output for one product. So one piece will have missing glue for glue gun number 1. The detection sensor for glue gun number 1 will see it missing, so the system will fail, and it'll track it to the end and reject it. And what this allows is for the end user to identify that we're kicking the right carton out when there's a failure. So it's kind of like a test feature to challenge the Leary system to ensure we are actively ejecting the right product or the right failure, if that makes sense. Again, it'll only allow you to use that feature if the alarm's turned on. If I turn it off like I just did, it basically just gives you a message that rejection off, alarm off. It won't let you do that test if you have the system alarm disabled. We have some customers who have, embedded procedures to challenge the Leary system, whether they'll manipulate a carton and send it through expecting it to be failed. So they'll create a bad product and send it through the machine and then ensure that that bad product gets ejected at the end of the line. This is just a quick and easy means of doing that same procedure on the fly with the gluing and detection station. Any questions on the glue gun station setup menu? Very good. Again, the two most critical things are our lead distances. So our trigger to valve tip lead distance and our trigger to detection lead distance. All right. Now I can see my live detected patterns. We do have a volume indicator. So our glue detection sensor's primary responsibility or primary job is to inspect the position of our glue events, the start, end, and length of all of our events. So I've got 3 events for glue gun 1. So what of our inspection sensor, our hot melt detection sensor, it's inspecting the position. It's making sure it starts within our tolerance, ends within our tolerance, and it's the correct length on all 3 events, okay? There's an additional form of inspection that your hot melt sensor can do, and that's called volume. So volume isn't really looking at position or location of the glue and the length of the glue events. It's looking at the amount of the glue events, okay? And the volume option can be kind of set up a few different ways. The way yours is currently set up is if your volume falls out of spec, it will not reject product, but it does give you a visual indication if something changed. So once you kind of deem the correct amount of glue or the size of the glue beads looks correct, the volume of the glue bead looks correct, you can simply go into where this says 100% and you can simply learn that base volume, okay? So whatever you learn as the base volume is what you're saying is 100%, is your good or your target, okay? And then what this allows you to do, it's more of a visual indicator the way you guys have it set up, but what it allows you to do is see if there's any significantly, diminished or increase of volume throughout your run. If you slow the machine down, you'll probably see the volume come up a little bit. If you speed the machine up and the beads of glue get a little bit thinner, you'll probably see the volume indicator drop some. When learning the base volume, it's ideal to make sure your detection sensor is set up properly. Let me set that back to 2. That's why I had that at 2. Okay. So this is your glue detection setup menu, your quad amplifier, and your quad amplifier runs in conjunction with your hot melt detection sensor head. And you'll see these series of LEDs on this menu here. They should match what you would see on the quad amplifier as well. So you have like an LED 1 through 10, and this is showing you the peak gain that we're seeing with the sensor head. So what we're detecting. And one of the things that's important if you're utilizing the volume inspection is you want to try to avoid having max gain or the gain be peaked to the 10th LED. So if you're detecting glue and you see all the lights light up all the way up to the 10th LED, you could still go in and you can learn your base volume value, but you're never gonna see it go above 100% after you learn your base volume level, because basically you're kind of peaked out on your amplifier. So once your LED is reading 10, you really don't have any more room to go any higher than what you learned as your base volume level. So you'll always be at 100%. It'll never tell you when there's more glue. It can still tell you when there's less glue or there's diminished volume, but it won't really show you if there's any added volume at any point. So ideally, when we set up this detection sensor, there's a sequence that's kind of best, rule of thumb to follow, but with no glue underneath the sensor, we should see no LEDs. It's pretty much that simple. If we ever see any LEDs on this menu or on the corresponding amplifier with no glue underneath it, we would want to relearn the background, okay? Now, ideally, I think the background should be learned when everything is at temperature. So your valves are at temperature, your tank, your hose, everything is at running temperature, but there's nothing underneath the sensor. So basically, we're just kind of learning ambient temperature around that area, so to speak, if that makes sense. So I don't really think there's any value of even having a carton or a product without glue underneath the sensor. What's important is that there is no glue under the sensor. So as long as there's no glue or anything under the sensor and your hot melt valves are at temperature, your hoses, everything's at running temperature, you can just go to this bottom icon right here and hit Learn Background. So that's how you kind of learn the ambient background temperature of everything, just by touching this little bottom icon. And if you already had a few LEDs or 1 or 2 LEDs showing, or if there was already LEDs on the menu or the amplifier, we would expect that they would disappear once you learn that background value. You should see no LEDs after that point. All right. And then the second part is this little up-down arrow. This is a learn glue target. So when I start running product through the machine and I want to learn the glue, I can actually select where my peak gain, where I'd like my peak gain to go to when I learn that glue value. So if I set it, I like 7 or 8. Those are kind of my sweet spots. That's what I normally use for training. So this little target I'll normally have at the number 7 LED or the number 8 LED position, like I do right now. It's at the 7 LED position. Now when I start running product through the machine, I can go ahead and learn my glue value, and my peak gain should go right to where my target's at. Now that I see my glue target is right where I want it, I can see my glue target is right where I want it, I can go ahead and learn my base volume level, which will set my 100%. All right. That's pretty much that. So that'll set my base volume at 100%. This is kind of more of a visual indicator now. It lets me know if anything significantly changes throughout my run. And I can see my amplifier is consistently hitting my number 7 LED for my gain, my peak gain. And that's pretty much it. You have 2 other icons here. It's very unlikely you'll ever have to use the adjust background increment. Okay, so when we were mentioning before, when we do our initial background learn, which is step 1, we expect that all the LEDs should disappear if there is any showing in the first place. So if you see any LEDs on the menu or on the amplifier, you should be able to hit this learn background button and the LEDs should zero out or disappear. This is an added adjustment to drown out or adjust the background level. But as long as there's no visible LED seen when you touch the Learn background icon and there's no product or nothing underneath the sensor, you're fine. That's all that's needed. Your next step would be to set your target and then hit the Learn Glue button while running product. Now, the reason we recommend learning the glue value while running as opposed to sitting still is sometimes we learn a very, very high signal when sitting still, as opposed to running. The glue beads are a little bit more thinned out, and you get a more accurate peak gain learn at your production run as opposed to just learning a pool of hot melt glue. So we usually recommend learning while running. That seems to work best. And we can still adjust the glue sensitivity if we choose to. Now, I don't actually have a quad amplifier hooked up to this pattern one, but this would allow me to, that peak gain LED or wherever that top LED is showing up, whether it's 7 or 8, I can fine tune it with these adjustments here. So if I learned my glue and it was originally at the 7th LED, but then after running for a little ways, maybe I turned the pressure down just ever so slightly, and my LED dropped from number 7 to number 6. It went down by 1. I could use this glue sensitivity adjustment to bump it back up to number 8. Any questions on the glue detection setup?
I guess I have one. As far as the sensor goes, how high do you want those from the glue nozzle, or because last time someone was out here, it seemed like we got different answers.
Well, you guys have you guys have a cover on the bottom of your sensor that you're familiar with, kind of like a black poly sort of cover.
Correct. And even the height on that, it seemed like it was a little bit different from machine to machine. So what do you recommend as far as how far to screw that in and then off of that cover or sensor, I guess, as far as height from the nozzle?
Yep. So on the little black cap, it threads onto the bottom of the sensor. There's actually 2 viewing holes on that poly cap, that plastic poly cap that threads onto the bottom of the sensor. So there's 2 viewing holes. And depending on the purpose of those viewing holes is so you know where the sensor starts as you're threading the cap on. You'll know where the start of the sensor is through that viewing hole. I think they're using the lower viewing hole.
So they're going higher than norm. They want to have a space higher
because they're moving, they're folding.
So to me, the easiest way is to measure to the top of the sensor.
Yeah.
So that was 65 millimeters, I think.
Okay.
And
that one was it.
Yeah, it's the same one.
Okay.
And then once you set that, you screw the cap on until it's 20 millimeters above the product.
Screw the cap on so it's 20 millimeters. I'm glad you asked that when you did, because I happen to have our lead engineer in here. Now, we can provide you a document that specifies
95 from the product to the top of the sensor.
Okay.
And then screw it on until there's 20 millimeters
Okay.
space.
95 from the top. We're going to add that to the setup guide.
It's easier to measure from there because you have the shield on it.
Okay, with the sensor mounted above the product, you can actually measure not from the top of the sensor, not the bottom, but from the top of the sensor to the product. I would set that at 95 millimeters, and we'll provide you some documentation. We'll email you an electronic copy that kind of specifies this stuff too. But from the top of the center to the product, I'd go ahead and make sure that's 95. And then the little plastic cap, you can thread onto the bottom of the sensor, so there's approximately 20 millimeters between the bottom of the cap and the product. Now your cap probably has a kind of an oval or rectangular kind of oblong opening at the bottom of it. Ideally, you will have that set up perpendicular to the product travel or the glue travel. And I would expect that all the sensors should be set up pretty much the same. So if there seems to be some variance amongst the focal distance of the hot melt sensors, it would probably be ideal to get those kind of all uniform. Yeah. Yeah, ideal. Our assumption is they're still functional. They still work, but for continuity purposes, it's probably ideal to have them all set at the same focal distance. Does that help?
Yes, it does.
Okay, all right. Any other questions in regards to setting up the hot melt glue detection? Okay. All right, we're almost done with the gluing and detection setup. Actually, we are done. I just wanted to let you guys know, I know this big icon in the upper left corner is always sitting here staring at you, and there probably hasn't been a lot of explanation behind it. Because you guys don't run really what we consider high-speed gluing, it doesn't really utilize the information in this menu. But basically, this is valve compensation. There's on and off compensation for every glue applicator. This is just a kind of a generic image when you open up the menu. It's basically telling you that, in order for the glue to actually start where I programmed it to start, because we have to compensate for the glue extruding from a nozzle and traveling through the air before it hits the substrate, that all takes real time. So what this is basically just kind of showing you in layman's terms is, we're firing the valve 2 milliseconds earlier than it would do on its own to hit our target or to get our glue to start with where we programmed it to start. So we're compensating for the amount of travel or time it takes the glue to travel from the nozzle down to the substrate. For your guys' application, it's so minute it doesn't even really affect you at all. You guys probably don't really notice any variation whatsoever. So we don't think there's going to be a lot for you to have to ever adjust or really have to troubleshoot with this menu. I just wanted to let you know what this menu is for and what it's trying to represent. It's basically on and off valve compensation. Okay. And every glue applicator that we activate from a Leary system has this menu, but like I said, depending on the application and the speed, it's not really referenced or utilized.
Jason, that's another locked function they can lock out?
We can lock this one out as well. Yeah, we can actually, all of these icons, and we're almost to the end here, guys. What I'm going to do is after we finish through these pressure screens, I'm going to show you, and you'll have to contact me or my support team, and we can give you the password of the day and assist you with assigning passwords to lock certain things out if you identify they're not really going to be beneficial or used by the end user. All right. Any other questions on the gluing and detection screen? And again, we went into Glue Gun 1, but they all have the same icons and the same stuff. So going in one is like going in all of them.
What kind of tolerance do you think you could hold on, like right now you have plus or minus 10 for tolerance for glue bead lengths on either the leading or trailing edge? What kind of tolerance, how little could we go if, say, a customer didn't want to accept much of a tolerance? How little would you, guarantee?
The first thing that's important to explain to a customer is what makes a bad carton versus a good carton. If this glue starts 2 millimeters earlier than where I programmed it to, is that necessarily a bad product? So that's the first and foremost thing we need to resolve with the customer. What's a good product versus a bad product? What causes an inside sticker, or what causes the product to not be usable versus usable? That's first and foremost. And honestly, Alicia, that's kind of the answer to your question. It's application dependent. We cater a lot to high speed applications that have folding scores. And if the adhesive goes beyond a folding score, it can create what's called an inside sticker. And if there's an inside sticker, that can create an issue with the fulfillment application when they go to put product inside the carton. The better your encoder resolution is, everything is dependent on setup. The system can be as accurate as you'd like it to be, as much time as you want to put into the setup, meaning Are your lead distances as accurate as possible? Is your encoder resolution? The encoder, we have to remember, is the heartbeat of the system. Everything is relevant to the encoder pulses. 4, 3, 3, 5, 6.
Low tolerance would be plus or minus 3 millimeters.
Even for a hot melt sensor?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So the calibration, yeah, I mean, encoder resolution's really key. So the more, the more accurate we can read the actual speed of the belts, and the more accurate we are with detecting our trigger lengths and our pattern lengths with our detection sensor and our triggers, and the more accurate we are set up with our lead distance parameters, the more accurate the system can be and the tighter tolerances we can hold. Ken, our head engineer I was just talking to, he's pretty comfortable with 3 millimeters for hot melt detection applications. Some of that is a bit depending on light spot sizes for the detection light spot sensors. But we would expect to be able to comfortably hold at 3 millimeter start end tolerances within your application.
Okay.
Now, if we fall out of that 3 millimeter tolerance and we start rejecting product, the question then becomes, is that product actually bad, or is it non-sellable product at that point?
Right. And then my other question would be, say a customer did want to utilize the spot gluing function. I think most of those valves and stuff are sold based on cycles. So do you see that affect like the lifetime of those glue valves and things from your experience?
Keith, I don't know if you want to chime in on that one or not. I personally don't really, I don't think I've ever experienced a failure on one of the speed surge.
500 million cycles.
I could look it up, but there's probably a spec from the OEM. Ken may have actually seen something that might have been 500 million cycles. I personally have not experienced a valve go bad or exceed its cycle limit.
Okay.
That's something we can look into and provide that information though. Valve cycle lifetime.
Alicia, that should be a Robotech question.
Okay. I just didn't know, yeah, because I know they're sold based on cycles, but I didn't know if, if you're firing it 10 times compared to one big long bead, if you've seen them, if those spot customers do end up replacing them faster. But I'll direct that to Robotech just so I know when a customer asks me.
And Alicia, I do expect that it's kind of, it probably is dependent on cycles. So right now you can kind of see I just changed event number 1. So before, oops, I guess I put them too tight together. Let's space them out just a little bit more. Okay, so before I was firing this valve 3 times per panel. This valve number 1 was being fired 3 times per panel, but now if you look closely, it's no longer being activated 3 times per panel. It's now 6 times per panel. So, and I think each one of those would justify as a cycle.
Got it.
I can make an adjustment to change how the volume icon is displayed. That will require the installer level access. And we would need to actually turn on what's called volume rejection. So the first option I have for volume is the total number of stations, which I want to make sure I've got 1 available for each glue gun. So that's why I've got 8 here. Okay, volume temperature rejection is turned on. So the one I need to turn on is volume learn, no alarm on failure. I think we just need to turn it on. I think I just needed to turn that feature on there. And I think what that's going to now give us. Okay, so if we wanted to, we can actually set the volume indicator up to actually reject product if it's out of tolerance. So once we learn our base volume or our good amount, which is still in this icon here where you see the 100%, you can learn the base volume. And that'll set my 100%, my expected amount of glue. And then I can go ahead and program a high tolerance for when there's too much glue. And, maybe that's 150%. I don't know. But identifying your high tolerance and your low tolerance could be a bit of trial and error if you did want to utilize the volume menu to reject product for not enough or too much volume. But you can adjust this high and low tolerance. So once you learn your base volume level, if the volume indicator ever hits your high tolerance or exceeds it, it'll start rejecting for too much glue, and vice versa. If it diminishes or lowers to your low end tolerance or lower, it will start failing for not enough glue. So you do have that ability. This file that I'm actually using a copied file from your last installation. So you did not, on your previous system setup, did not have this high and low tolerance setting, but it is something that can be enabled if you're interested.